So if you have a very large cohort of students and you do a lecture, you've got say 100 students in a space, it's very difficult to take the lecture out of that space and then do this type of group activity. Because splitting up 120 students into groups, there isn't enough time to do lots of group activities, so that can be challenging. As with the classroom layout, if the lecture hall is just rows of seats, it's very difficult to use that type of space for group activity. Students have to turn around and it's awkward to sit in that space. So quite difficult challenges for the size of the cohort and the classroom layout. Attendance can be an issue. Students have a lecture that they can go and watch, they don't have to come in at all. So that's why we're looking at those engaging activities to get them to watch the lecture, but also know that they have to come along to the active learning classroom session, because that's where they're going to expand their knowledge. But that can be very difficult, a very difficult concern in that students aren't going to attend the lecture because the lectures, they can see it outside of the lecture hall. And lack of engagement, that's the critical thing, that's what I've been talking about throughout this, is getting students to engage with that content. And that might be about managing expectations. They may well be just used to sitting in a classroom and hearing someone talk at them. So it's about managing their expectations as to what flipped classroom means, what their contribution to that means in terms of how they work in an active learning environment. So managing that expectation so they know what they're going to get, they know what the advantages of that approach are, and they understand that, so they will engage with it. And of course, workload. We can give a lecture, we can write a lecture, we can deliver a lecture, but if that's now being recorded, we now have to develop active learning activities. So we have to employ different approaches in order to engage with our students in an active learning environment. So that may well have workload implications because we've prepared our lecture, we've recorded our lecture, but now we have other work to do because we've got to prepare materials for that active learning space. So there are lots of different challenges in delivering flipped classrooms. Okay, moving on to the second part, looking at scenario-based approaches to teaching and learning. Scenario-based approaches is a methodology. The aims are to promote deep learning and awareness. And this is achieved by involving your participants in realistic situations. And in these situations, they're required to consider a wide range of factors, make decisions based on that consideration. And then these two last bits are really critical in this model. Reflect on the outcomes of their decisions and what they've learned from it. So there's two reflective processes. Reflecting on the outcomes of their decisions, but also reflecting on how they've learned from engaging with the scenario. And scenario-based approaches are part of a bigger range of approaches. This could include problem-based learning, where students are dealing with problems, approaching problems. Storification, so taking a case study, for example, and creating a story, a narrative around that particular approach. Gamification, so bringing games-based approaches into education, so trying to find ways of playing games with content in order to increase knowledge. And these are often referred to as serious games. So a game in which education is one of the outcomes, that can be a serious game, and we'll look at some of those shortly. And the idea of discovery learning, where students are immersed in an open space and they're discovering learning. So there's no path for them to follow. There are lots of different paths that they can follow and find their own learning and discover the learning in those open spaces. So scenario-based learning incorporates a range of different approaches. But key to all of this is that we're involving participants in realistic situations. That's what we're trying to do. So for example, some of the examples here, I've got an accident scene as a situation. These situations might be in a hospital environment, in a ward-based environment. We might have a crime scene environment, which could involve policing students or forensic students. Lab-based skills, lab-based work, or youth work, social work, education. So realistic situations that are relevant to lots of different spaces. And the core component of this is that all of these situations contain a degree of uncertainty and complexity which are consistent with lived experiences. So in any of these scenarios, we are presented with complex decisions, some of which we may well not be certain of what the outcome of that decision might be. That is a normal lived experience. So it's about trying to map those processes so students get to engage in those realistic situations. So here's an example of a scenario, and this is the basic sort of entry-level scenario, the technology-less free scenario. Here we have an example of a scenario. This is one that's used in midwifery. So we have some information and then a series of questions that the students are exploring based on that scenario. So what I've been looking at is how can we turn these types of scenarios into more interactive and involved scenarios? How can technology be brought to bear on this? So I've got some examples, and these sort of look at storification scenarios, the first one especially. Here's an emergency room scenario. I know the content of this is a little bit unpleasant, but again, it's an important consideration. Okay, so here we've had a scenario and it's been storified, and it's exploring where we have those multiple decisions to make in certain situations. So we're in a situation and there are 3 potential options that we might choose in this situation. And whatever I choose, that changes the nature of the situation. So I'm in a hospital and a patient's just been brought through the door. So I might call the ambulance control. So that's my decision. Now I'm presented with a different type of scenario based on my decision and my choice. And so on and so forth. Call the trauma team, the next one, grab the nurse in charge for the patient, or that better remove the patient's burnt clothing. That was the wrong decision in that particular scenario. And as you can see, this is where the notion of serious gains come into play because of the outcome of that action. So we can explore serious consequences of our decisions in safe environments. So the student knows that was the wrong decision at a particular point. They can explore the repercussions of that scenario, but in a safe way. So we can explore why that was the wrong decision, that's the result of that decision, and so on. That's how we can take these scenarios into more serious spaces, but safe spaces where students can explore those different potentials. Another example, this is a more developed example. I'm not going to do the one by Catherine Flick because she's doing presentation tomorrow and she might do one of those examples. So here's a more developed version of a scenario. This one is called The Mystery of the Missing Fish. And so in this scenario, it's school and some fish have gone missing from the school fish tank. And so our job is to find out if we can solve the mystery. Have some of the children at school been the ones who've taken the fish? Let's skip past this bit. But what we're actually using this scenario for is to get the students to use a data collection sheet and then interpret the data on that sheet. So that's the subversive education that we're using this scenario about fish to get the students to engage with. Fish. So we have our suspects, and we can look at each of their fish tanks. So we can count up the different kinds of fish in the fish tank and add this information to our data sheet. And we can do that for all of our fish tanks. And then we can look at the pet shop where the fish have been purchased from, and then we can make comparisons between our data sheet and the purchases and the school fish tank purchases, and from that information work out who it was that had taken the missing fish. So that's the educational purpose of this scenario. It just presents that in a more interactive and engaging way. So the students are engaging with an educational process, not actually really thinking they're engaging in an educational process. It's more fun and interesting and exciting. So just a different way of approaching that use of scenarios. Looking at this in a bigger picture, one of the things I'm exploring with midwifery, looking at the scenarios that midwifery are doing, is trying to find ways in which we can actually deliver those scenarios to the students. And one of the ideas we're working on developing as a prototype is a virtual town, in a sense. simply a map, an interactive map, where different scenarios can be taking place. All this is a front portal that you can click on something that will take you into that scenario. That's all this does, this map. It allows you to have a different way of accessing it. This isn't in a teaching and learning space. It's not in Moodle, it's not in Blackboard, so it doesn't look like it's a teaching thing. So it might drive more engagement into those materials. So for example, my emergency room incident, that was based on an incident at this house, number 1 Park Rise. Here's the incident. It's rather gruesome and grim, but that's the person, that's where they live, and then that takes you then to the emergency room, where you then do that emergency room scenario. And just finding a way of creating a space that's different, interesting, engaging for students to explore these scenarios. It's a real environment. It's not three-dimensional, it's not immersive, it's not immersive like Second Life would be. It's very two-dimensional, but it's just a different way of engaging with that content, ways for students to engage with that content. Okay, and some of the challenges of the use of scenarios. Again, we've got the issue of student engagement, driving students to engage with these scenarios, because many of them require self-directed learning. They will have to just explore the scenarios on their own. You could try tying them into some form of assessment, so they have to work through a scenario, and then how they work through that is assessed. But that's quite challenging to do that type of assessment. So it's about how students get to engage with these scenarios as an important part of their learning, and how they understand that that's an important part of their learning, that they engage with those scenarios. The development time can be quite critical, because you've got to create these scenarios. So there is a workload issue around how you develop these scenarios, because that relies a lot on your ability to construct this type of scenario. So you've got to be able to write some type of a story. You've got to understand that in this situation you've got these particular choices. Where do we go next? What kind of story do I write at the next part, etc. So you've got to have an understanding of how to construct narrative, and that might not be a skill available to all. So again, that can have an impact on development time. And then if you're using these different types of spaces, so I have that interactive map, there's issues around the ongoing development of that space, the oversight of that space, the administration of that space, who controls that space and how is it managed. So again, the possibilities of these approaches are really exciting, but there are lots of key challenges that need to be overcome in order to put them into play. The way I'm approaching this is I'm doing things in a very small chunks, very, very tiny little approaches, bit by bit. One of the advantages of that is that you can map how long it takes to create this resource and implement it in teaching and learning. And then by mapping that, that gives me some key data that I can then pass on. If we're looking to expand and scale this bigger across the institution, I can then go to those who provide resources for these things and say, look, this is how much staff time is required to develop this resource. This is how much resource infrastructure is required. So then I can map that approach. So by doing it a little bit at a time, we can map that data, and then we can hopefully get those on board who give money for various things to actually help to implement these approaches. I've got 2 minutes for any questions before Gina does her bit. Yeah. One thing about the technology, actually, the technology that I use for the emergency room, where you make your choices, that's actually some open source technology that's available online. It's called Twine. It's reasonably easy to use, Twine, and you can find it online.
Is it possible to use your